Duncan Cartledge Online, Insights for Construction Professionals. Welcome to this latest podcast from Duncan Cartledge Online, the online resource for construction professionals. Duncan Cartledge Online offers more than 9 hours of video presentations that are available 24/7 for just £7 a month. Please remember to subscribe to your usual podcast provider so you don't miss out on any updates, and be sure that you visit our YouTube channel for additional content. It's great to have you with us again for another episode. As always, I'm joined by Barney, my red Labrador, who helps keep an eye on things and occasionally offers some invaluable advice. Both Barney and I would be delighted if you could take a minute to write a review. Your feedback means a lot to us. If this is your first time listening to Duncan Cartledge Online podcasts, welcome. Please remember to subscribe and catch up with previous episodes. To our existing subscribers, thank you very much for your continued support. Please help us by spreading the word about the podcasts. In this jam-packed episode, Barney and I will be looking at retention to be banned, PFI, what's going on, cost modelling, a look at high-rise buildings, and the biggest threat to UK construction material supply chain. But before we start, here's some exciting news. There's a new double act come to rescue the RICS. Now, you've heard of the Crankies, Little and Large, and of course not forgetting the Chuckle Brothers. Well, according to Building, a new double act is about to tread the boards. Yes, give it up for McLean, that's Mothman's replacement, and Young. Their mission, should they agree to accept it, is to rebuild confidence, modernise qualifications, and reconnect with the members of the RICS. As they say in Scotland, aye, right. But now for something completely different. Retention to be banned. The headline is Retention to be banned. Yes, you heard it right. Sounds good, eh? Nearly 32 years after Sir Michael Latham concluded in his landmark report, Constructing the Team, that the practice of holding back money as security against defective or unfinished work was not working, it is set to be consigned to the dustbin of history. But before we start to get too excited, make sure that we read the small print. In the first place, it is only a proposal and it is set to go out to consultation. And like so many proposals, it may fail to get any further. And it is proposed to apply only to persistent late payers. Reading on, the proposal seems to apply only to clients failing to release retention money when it becomes due rather than a complete ban. But we'll have to wait and see. Concerns have been raised about ensuring that the scope of the legislation is broad enough to prevent circumvention, if that's a word, and the cost and availability of alternative forms of surety. The changes include a 60-day cap on payment terms for all large firms when paying smaller suppliers, and a mandatory interest rate on all late payments. In addition, all commercial contracts must include a statutory rate of 8% above the Bank of England base rate. A suggested timescale for the change is a 12 to 24-month transitional period for contractual arrangements, financial planning, stakeholder engagement, and the development of alternative assurance mechanisms. But, come on, we all know how the industry works. If your payment is late, you don't ruffle feathers, or you may not get any more work. Retention payments are regularly withheld and used as a bargaining chip to leave a further discount or favour, and even if you're fortunate to get work, you will be required to engage in an aggressive negotiation process to reduce agreed prices. I call it the supply chain squeeze. The reaction from the construction industry to the news was muted. After years of failed attempts to tackle retentions, many in the sector were left pinching themselves in disbelief. Sober heads issued warnings that clients might find ways around the legislation by altering payment schedules to keep hold of more of their cash at the earliest stages. Preventing any such loopholes from appearing will be a major challenge for those drafting the retention laws. And now moving on to a major headline in the construction media, PFI. What is going on? You may recall that last year there were whisperings in the corridors that the Labour government were going to resurrect the Private Finance Initiative, or PFI. The government's infrastructure strategy proposed the return of a form of PFI for the first time since 2018 to be used in limited circumstances, including healthcare centres. However, the structure has yet to be revealed. Now, in early March, the Department of Health and Social Care quietly slipped out a tender for bidders to come and talk about a £1 billion package of work to the health estate. While the volume of work is eye-catching enough, it was the type of procurement to be used to deliver this package that was significant, because a short notice kick-started the first procurement of what effectively is a private finance initiative tender process. PFI was one of the main planks of the last Labour government's public building programme, but after a sustained anti-PFI campaign by, amongst others, unions like the BMA, PFI and its successor, PF2, was retired in 2018. I have to confess that I was a fan of PFI. Just take a look around at many of the crumbling Victorian hospitals, schools and prisons that would not have been replaced if it was not for the widespread use of PFI at the turn of the millennium. In fact, I wrote an article for a health journal extolling the virtues, entitled Defender of the Faith. PFI procurement involves a consortium designing, building, financing and operating public infrastructure. Although the majority of PFI projects were delivered on time, a major criticism of the classic PFI process was the cost of private finance, compared to public sector borrowing costs, and the subsequent profits being made from selling off the equity on the completed up-and-running projects. In a major departure, it is rumoured that the new model may allow for the government to hold an equity stake in completed projects, which may address some of these criticisms. One of the more controversial aspects of classic PFI of 20 years ago was off-balance sheet accounting. An off-balance sheet accounting rating means borrowing would not count against the government's fiscal rules, as it does not show up as borrowing, potentially leaving more resources to spend on other projects. At this point, it is not clear whether on or off-balance sheet accounting will apply to the new model, which allows politicians, in particular Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor, to claim that they have provided all this new infrastructure and still balance the books. Hey presto. And now moving on to cost modelling, high-rise buildings. About 50 years ago, yes, it really was that long, I wrote a book on construction design economics, which basically does what it says on the tin. It discusses the impact of design on cost. One of the solutions I analysed was the economies of building high-rise. Of course, the definition of high-rise will differ depending on where you live. For example, what exactly is a skyscraper? In the UK, a high-rise building is generally defined under the Building Safety Act 2022 as a building of at least 18 metres in height or with at least 7 stories. This 18-metre 7-storey threshold is critical for the building safety regulations, risk reporting and registration. However, in the Middle East, Far East and the US, definitions of high-rise differ due to a wider spread use of tall buildings than we are used to in the UK. Recently, Turner and Townsend published a look at the same cost model based on data from about 100 high-rise towers worldwide, concluding that costs have risen sharply over the past 5 years in all the cities tracked. As discussed in my book, high-rise is a good solution in cases where real estate prices are prohibitive, and the following cost factors are offset. Tall buildings tend to have a good wall-to-floor ratio. What is that and why it is important? The wall-to-floor ratio is the amount of external envelope required to cover a square metre of floor space, the external envelope being a cost-significant element, meaning that it contributes a significant percentage to overall costs. Good examples of economic wall-to-floor ratios are the ill-fated World Trade Center in New York, with its load-bearing external walls, and more recently the Leadenhall building in London, known as the cheese grater, where circulation spaces were confined to off-site prefabricated units situated at the rear of the building, thereby making the maximum use of income-generating floor area. Tall buildings have greater exposure to high winds, resulting in larger cores and structural frames compared to medium-rise buildings. In tall buildings, MEP, mechanical, electrical and plumbing needs are greater and more complex, which together with the larger frame results in lower gross net areas than other models. There is a comparatively small pool of contractors capable to build high-rise, resulting in less competitive tendering. In high-rise, there is generally greater use of plant. For example, in the Leadenhall building in London referred to previously, Laing O'Rourke had to construct a purpose-made tower crane due to site restrictions. For some, the making a statement is very important. That's the expectation that a tower will create a wow factor with all the resultant costs and lack of usable floor area. History has proved that the more signature the building, the greater the risks. The Scottish Parliament, for example. And last but not least, high-rise buildings generally have greater maintenance costs. But it's not all about height. Plan shape also has a major influence. The nature of these impacts will vary based on design. Turner and Townsend conclude that the relationship between cost and height is not straightforward, but typically tipping over the 20-story mark brings a new set of implications, and even more so when you reach the super tall, that's greater than 300 metres, and the mega tall, greater than 600 metres high. And finally, geopolitics. What impact is the war in Iran having on construction? I joined a BCIS webinar recently on Construction Outlook, what's next for the industry? And not unsurprisingly, many of the questions were to do with the impact of the war in the Middle East on construction. After a month of warfare, material prices have increased, in particular steel and plastics. Material cost inflation, which had already been on the rise prior to the conflict, is now likely to accelerate further. Materials such as steel, aluminium, plastics, MEP components are particularly exposed alongside energy-intensive products such as cement, bricks, plasterboard, glass, asphalt and insulation, which are expected to see significant price increases as production costs rise globally. According to the Construction Leadership Council, the war in the Middle East is now the biggest threat to UK construction's material supply chain. Shipping costs for goods imported from the Far East have risen significantly as containers are rerouted. Price volatility has seen costs increase from between 20 to as much as 100%, and the workarounds are resulting in longer delivery times. The manufacturers, suppliers, and distributors of construction projects and materials are by far the largest users of road and rail networks, and there is clear evidence that they are feeling the impact at the fuel pumps with a surge in petrol and diesel prices. Margins across the industry are set to be eroded, with firms having to absorb higher costs as costs are passed along the supply chain. Profit margins will be squeezed at every level, with SMEs being particularly vulnerable. Contractors may seek to rely on contractual relief mechanisms, for example, compensation events under the NEC or relevant events under JCT, relying on force majeure or other contractual triggers. These provisions typically apply where performance is prevented or materially delayed by events outside the party's control, rather than simply becoming more expensive or commercially inconvenient, although the position is obviously always contract specific. Depending on the drafting of the contract, contractors may be entitled to extensions of time and or additional payments where delays arrive from certain causes such as government action, war or hostilities, or embargoes and sanctions. Over the years, a definition of force majeure, or act of God, or exceptional event has tasked lawyers, but generally to qualify the exceptional event must satisfy the following requirements. The event must be beyond the affected party's control. The event must be one that could not have reasonably been provided for before the contract was entered into. Once the event has arisen, it must be unavoidable or not reasonably capable of being overcome. And finally, the event must not be substantially attributable to the other party. It certainly seems that our learned friends will be making a few bob out of this one. Understandably, contractors, because of the inflationary pressures, have become reluctant to sign fixed price contracts. Also, there is financing and investment uncertainty as interest rates may now increase instead of being cut. Expectations interest rates will have to rise cause lenders to push up mortgage rates and pull hundreds of mortgage products over the past few weeks. And finally, risk profiling and insurance becomes even more essential. Let's hope that peace breaks out soon. Well, that's all for this episode. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you for listening right through to the end. Barney and I think your stamina is world class. This has been another episode from Duncan Cartledge Online. We'd really appreciate it if you could help us by spreading the word and subscribing, and, if you have the time, writing a review. Until next time, thank you for your continual support and take care.